doing the analysis of the Mishnah, moving on from some of very special aspects of esrog, like it's a bit like it's effective as a fruit, and it needs to be able to have the possibility of eating it, to the aesthetic aspects. We discussed yesterday the issue about the sort of protrusions or the warts, and with a particular focus on the slanting part, where there even one or two is even a small number is even one is a problem. The chotamo, literally the nose, and also the issue about the pittum, where, as I mentioned, there's a whole debate in the Rishonim exactly what the pittum is, but we sort of know what we assume it to be. Of course, the sort of almost like the mushroom cloud looks of the peg and the canopy that comes out of the top. Now the Gemara continues 3 lines from the bottom. Niklaf, if it's peeled. So Amar Rava, Hay esrog the iglid, ke'ahina sumka kshera. An esrog that is as peeled like a red date is kosher, meaning presumably it's like totally peeled. So v'hanantna niklaf pasul. What do you mean? Our Mishnah says if it's peeled, it's pasul. Lokaj, it's not difficult. Habakula habamiktsasa. It's the difference between all of it or part of it. So obviously the question is which is which. So Rashi says, maybe somewhat ironically, that if it's all peeled, it's kosher. That's maybe the analogy to the peeled date or the red date. If it's partly peeled and partly unpeeled, then it looks very spotty, menumar, like the Gemara said before, and that's a bigger problem. Tosfos says no, because in a minute we're about to see a comparison between some of these psulim of the esrog and trefot, simane trefot, part aspects of an animal that make it a trefa. And there, the Gemara discusses that if an animal has its skin peeled off, how exactly that happened, I don't know. Rashi says maybe due to a disease or something. If all of the skin is off, then it's a treifa. If most of the skin is off, but some still remains, then it's not a treifa, because then it can basically regenerate and heal. So Tosfos argues that based on the comparison we're about to make between some of these invalidities and a treifa, actually, if some of the skin is still around, it would be kosher. If all of the skin is off, if it's peeled, it would be pasul. Now, of course, thank you. The question of exactly what peeled means, does it mean that the rind isn't there? That's like you missing a lot, and we're about to see a whole issue about chaser, about things that are missing, parts of the actual esrog itself. It couldn't mean not that the whole rind is peeled off. It could mean like an outer thin layer of the rind, but exactly what constitutes niklaf, how much are we talking about being peeled and it could still be kosher, is, how thick, as it were, of the outer rind is not clear. And one of the things we are going to have to look at is this issue about chaser, because chaser seems to be a clear invalidity, and if that's true, you wonder how any part peeled could be okay. So maybe, again, it's a very thin part of the outer rind is maybe being treated differently. So that's the issue of peeled. Yes?
I'm sorry to go back. Did you say at the end of yesterday, maybe I missed it, anything about the last Rashi at the bottom of the previous Amud? About, you got his teacher of this. Is that Rabbi Yaakov Zikner Rabbi Yaakov? Is that his grandfather? Rashi?
No, it's not his grandfather. They're his teachers. Yeah.
Do you have anything to say about it? It's like so interesting.
Yeah, no, I can't talk off the top of my head about Rashi's Rebbeim. Okay, so nistak nikav. Now we go from peeled to cracked or with a hole in it. So if it has a hole and is missing something, it's a problem. A hole without being chaser anything is not a problem. And cracked is a problem. How far cracked is also not clear. I'll get back to that in a minute, but the Gemara is going to talk to the issue of the hole. Tani Ula Bar Chanina, Nikav Nekev Mifolash B'Mashahu. V'she'ena Mifolash B'Ki'isar. If there's a hole that goes through and through, like take a pin and you go all the way through one side of the esrog to the next, even if it's a tiny hole. If it is not mifolash, then it has to be the size of an isar, which is a pretty big coin. I mean, not big, but it's not tiny. It's whatever. Who knows? It's a penny, let's say. Now, the question is, this is, the way Rashi and Tosfos both understand this, this is if it is not chaser mashu, meaning if it is chaser mashu, they both understand that even if it's a tiny hole, if a little actually is chaser, it's invalid. They understand that this is qualifying the statement in the Mishnah that a hole without anything lacking is valid. And they say not all holes. If the hole is significant enough, it goes from end to end, even if no part of the esrog, fell away as a result. You put a pin through it. I mean, obviously, by the way, you imagine that some juices come out of an esrog, right? Thank you. Right, when some juices come out, but whatever, no real, no physical, whatever, like piece falls off. If you put a hole through it, then even though it's not chaser mashu, although the Mishnah said a hole without missing anything is kosher, he's limiting it. And if the hole goes all the way through, or if the hole is as big as a isar, like again, imagine you took, I don't know, like a thick peg and you banged it in, okay, but it didn't actually, a piece didn't fall off, it just made a big hole in it, then if it's that big size, even without going through and through, if it goes through and through, even if it's tiny, even if nothing fell off, it is still pasul. That is the way they're reading this, okay? So that big of a hole, or that thorough of a hole, extensive a hole is pasul, even without anything lacking. Now, by Rava asked, "No do be'esrog simanei treifa mahu." Let's say the esrog has signs that would make an animal a treifa. What would be the lacha? So the Gemara says, "My kami bayale." What are you asking? Iniklov, if the bam of peeled, which we know that an animal, it's called in Hilchos Treifa gluda, an animal with its skin peeled off. So tanina, that's in the Mishnah, that niklov is pasul. Inistak, if it's cracked, tanina, we taught. Now, what's a cracked comparison to? Like the cracked trachea. So if the it's cracked from like the top. These are these things here are like are around the top of your. This is your voice box on the top of your trachea, right? So if like from the top sort of cartilage to the bottom, it's cracked all the way through, right? In animal's trachea, that would be an invalidity. That would be pasul. Now, based on this, by the way, I should mention again, Tosfos takes the comparisons to treifa very seriously. So the same way by the issue of peeled, he says it would have to all be peeled like a treifa. By the issue of cracked, he said it would have to be cracked all the length of the esrog. The same way when we speak about like a cracked trachea in Hilchos, in Hilchos Treifas, we talk about not a little crack, but a crack that goes the entire length from the bottom to the top cartilage. So Tosfos again understands these comparisons quite literally, not just like, oh, isn't that interesting? This idea is, it's a similar type of a thing, a similar label. He understands that even exactly the parameters are the same as they are by treifa. So that's nistak. Inikav, if it's about a hole, most of treifot are like holes. A hole in the lung, a hole in the heart, a hole in an intestine. So tanina, that's also in our Mishnah. A hole that something is lacking from, it's a treifa. Now, by the way, in Hilchos, I mean, that's pasul. In Hilchos treifos, it doesn't matter if a piece of the lung came out as a result of the hole or not. The hole itself is the problem. So it's not exactly the same, although Tosfos tries as much as possible to make them equal. But the point is, all of these three things in our Mishnah are types of treifot. So what do you mean you have a question about treifa? That's exactly the Mishnah. It has those things that are treifot in the Mishnah. Now, before we see what Rava's question is, obviously it should strike us as quite strange that we're trying to, sort of make a list of psule esrog parallel to a list of, it could be coincidence, but as I said, the Gemara, by saying, what if it has treifa simanim, doesn't sound like it's coincidence. Tosfos' attempt to learn out the parameters from treifa doesn't sound like it's a coincidence. And again, I want to point out that this once again evokes this idea of korban. So now that's time number 3, and for those that are keeping score. Number 1, we had by the lulav and mitzvah b'aveira, was all learned from the world of korbanot, bevetem gozul v'tapiseach, and so on. Number 2 was the discussion about the limud from esrogim was like just like a pen of animals, has tmimim uba'alei mumim, has young sheep and older sheep, etc. And 3 is this issue now quite explicit of treifa. Now, treifa is not just a korban problem, it's a kashrus problem, but it seems to be, it's a classic issue here about aesthetics and so on. It does seem to evoke, once again, the world of korbanot. So what is the halacha here? So the Gemara says, what do you mean? It's all in the Mishnah. So the Gemara says, no. Ki kami bayale kida ula. The question was like ula. Okay, what does that mean? Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Like the statement of Ula in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Reya shenishpacha kikiton, if you have a lung that spills out like a ladle, meaning it's liquefied on the insides, ksheira, that's kosher. The Amar Rava, now Rava qualified that by saying, V'hu dekaimi simponaha. That's only if the arteries are still around, even though some of the insides have liquefied. So the Gemara says, Halo kaimi simponaha, treifa. Fine, but without those, it's going to be a treifa. So that's what we know by a lung. Hachamai, what would be the story here? Now, what would be if the inside of the esrog, like the meat, the juice, had liquefied? So Dilma Hasamhu de lo Shalik Ba'avira. Hadabari. So the question is, now again, it's fascinating, the assumption. The assumption is if that the insides had completely liquefied, then it would be pasul, just like an animal's treifa. But what about this qualification that we added? That if the arteries are around, it's going to remain kosher even if the rest has liquefied. So let's say the parallel would be by the esrog, like the meat of the esrog sort of exists in these like chambers, right? I mean, did anybody sort of, you know what I mean? It's sort of like, it's like a citrus fruit, right? So let's say the meat has liquefied, but the sort of the wall structures, the chambers are still there. So the same way by a treifa, when some of the inner structure remains, even if it's liquefied by a lung, it'll be kosher. Will this also still remain kosher? Again, notice the assumption. If it's totally liquefied, of course it's possible. How do we know? Because that's an animal's treifa. But how about this technical point that if the inner sort of structure is there, will that allow it to remain kosher? Will it be like a lung or not? Dilma Hasam Hu Delo Shalik Ba'avira, by the lung, that there is air doesn't have access to it, which is again quite fascinating. What do you mean?
Ironic. It's exactly what the lung.
Exactly, the lung brings air in and out. I really don't understand that. So in that case, hadar bari. So maybe as long as some of the inner structure is still there, it can heal. But here, the shalit ba'avira, it's exposed to the air. It must mean the whole esrog is exposed to air. As opposed to there, the lung air goes in, but the whole lung isn't exposed. In fact, quite fascinating difference. The insides there are more exposed to air than here. But anyway, here that it's exposed to air, sruche masrachat, it'll spoil and it'll only get worse. Maybe it doesn't matter. And the same way there, if the inner structure is okay, it's okay. It remains good here too. Tashma, coming here. Esrog tapuach saruach. If you have an esrog that is sort of bloated, or due to some obviously thing going on there, not just naturally big, but like swelled, or it's spoiled. Rotting, let's say, kavush shaluk, or it's pickled, or it's boiled. Kushi, if it's an Ethiopian esrog, or might just mean if it's black. We'll see. Well, we'll see. I'm saying that because what the Gemara is going to say about the word in a minute. Lavan, or if it's white, umenumar, or spotted, pasul, it's invalid. Esrog kadur, if it's totally spherical like a ball, pasul, it's invalid. V'yeshomim af hatiyom, and some even say even a twin, like two esrogim that grew sort of twinned together, joined, co-joined. Esrog aboser, if it is an unripe esrog, Rabbi Akiva posel v'chachamim machshirim. Rabbi Akiva said it's invalid. The Chachamim say it's valid. Gidlo b'tfus, if you grew the esrog in a tfus, a mold, you put a mold over a very small esrog, so as it continued to grow, it grew according to the shape of the mold. The asa'ok mean birya acheret, so if the mold made it look like a completely different type of a fruit, did not have a normal esrog shape afterwards, pasul, it's invalid, which means if you have a mold that keeps it within the esrog shape, it could be kosher. So, people that have these like perfectly, I don't know what they do, some types of esrogim, they grow like the shapes that exactly the shapes that people want. Is it that they've basically selected out from thousands of esrogim? Is it that they've actually grafted esrogim and created certain type of an esrog strain that grows particular shapes? I understand that some of them, what they do, like some people like the gartel esrog, the ones that sort of are more like hourglass shape. So what they do is they go out when the esrog is growing and it's still young, and they basically put like a string around the middle, a tight string, and that actually makes it grow, into that more gartel shape. So as long as it stays within the frame, within the range of esrog-looking shapes, it's okay. So those are the whole list, but let's get to our point. So the Gemara says, Ktani Miha, so that was a very nice long list, but one of the things we taught, nevertheless, is Tapuach Saruach, is a bloated and spoiled. My left Tapuach Mibachut, doesn't this describe two different scenarios? One is some external type of a thing, it's bloated on the outside, The, meaning, or saruach mibifnim, some type of a spoiling on the inside, meaning some type of a liquefaction in the inside, and you see it's pasul. Now again, how we know that means with the inner chamber still present, without the inner chamber still present, that somehow seems to get bracketed. But look, you see if the insides are liquefied, it's invalid. That was your question. Mar says, no, not necessarily. These could be talking about two types of external problems. V'lo kasha, it's not difficult. Had tapach afagav delo sarach. One could be that it's bloated, even though it's not rotting. Had sarach afagav delo parach, or it could be rotting without being bloated, but it's a rotting on the outside, not on the inside. Now, again, it's quite fascinating because talking about the question of how serious is the comparison to treifa, all the other things were externally visible. And therefore, you could say, okay, that's a definition of hadar. It's not really a problem of a treifa problem. But this issue, right, although the way the Gemara frames the issue is the Gemara takes it for granted that if the insides were totally liquefied, it's a problem, and only wants to know, is it okay if you have the inner chamber still there? But, here the proof was not to discuss the inner chambers. It seemed to be the basic issue of whether the liquefied insides are a problem or not, and that's harder to understand why that's an issue for esrog, right? Because it doesn't, if there's no hadar issue, at least there's nothing externally obvious, as the Gemara says. It's a question, is it outside or even inside? Does it stop being a fruit? Is it a definition of pri? Again, it sounds like the real problem is because it's a problem by treifa. That should make it a problem by esrog, even though there's no necessarily intrinsic or natural reason why that should be an esrog issue. So it seems that it's more than just a comparison. There really is some sense we should borrow psulim by treifa and apply them to esrog, and again, suggesting, I would say, this korban comparison. I will say one other thing about this because of the issue of treifa. Tosafos says, well, we know by treifa that if there's a hole, right, in the lung, for example, it doesn't have to go through the whole lung from one end of the lung to the next. It just has to get, into the hollow of the lung, through the wall. It doesn't have to go through and through. So why did the Gemara say before if the hole went through and through? So Tosafos makes an interesting point. He says, you know what? Maybe that's right. Maybe if it's actually going opposite the meat of the esrog, once the hole gets through the rind into the meat, that's like a hole that gets through the wall of the lung into the chamber of the lung. When we said it only if it went through and through is a problem is when it's at the top of the esrog and it's not, or the bottom where it's not opposite the meat. There, he said, that's like one single wall. But if you have basically a wall and an inner chamber, which is what you have on the middle part, as soon as it reaches the inner chamber, it'll be a problem, like by a lung, like by a heart. When it's the issue of the through and through is only when it's all wall, when it's at the top or the bottom. Again, what's fascinating is Tosafos continuing to assume it's not just a broad stroke comparison. We're actually going to learn the details of the psulim by the esrog from parallel types of psulim by treifa. Takes this comparison very seriously. Charlie, you've had your hand up for a while.
The description they're making here almost seems like they're describing a lemon rather than a citron, because a citron or an etrog or a citron doesn't have much flesh in it. It's mostly rind. And a lemon is this rind with the flesh inside, and you would not want to eat it if it had become completely liquefied. And I'm wondering if they made the same kinds of distinctions back then that we do today.
Well, I don't know. In terms of what?
Yeah, I'm wondering. They're more describing a lemon.
I don't see why you say that. Where do you see them more describing a lemon?
They're talking about the peel.
Right.
You don't peel an etrog. It's the rind is most of
But that's what I said. It's not clear to me that really means the whole peel is peeled off. It could mean like a thin layer of the peel. It's like, imagine saying if it had flaked off. Okay? That's why I don't think, because if it was really the whole peel, then it would be chasser. And, you wouldn't have to say, a separate idea of niklaf. And certainly Rashi, that it's until it's niklaf kulo. So I don't think we're talking, that's what I said before, that you actually removed the rind. I think we're talking about some type of flaking of the very outer layer. I don't see any evidence for what you're saying. I'm sorry. Okay, so now the Gemara continues. Yeah.
In the treifa, you chef the animal, and then you do a physical examination, you see what you got. Right. How many times do you buy a nice piece of fruit, and you take it home, and you cut it open, and you find it's bruised, it's damaged, It's rotten, you don't eat it, the orange all dried out. Well, what do we do with this esrog? How do we know about all
How
these
would we
things?
know? Well, that's the point. Part of the chiddush of this question is it's the only thing that's internal. Everything else is external. And that's why, you're saying a good point. How would you know? I imagine you would shake it and you could hear, but especially if the Gemara is making a distinction, which is whether the inner chambers are...
Liquefied and stuff.
Well, the only one that you can't know is this one that is being raised here that's not in the Mishnah, which is the inside liquefied. Everything else is external, right? Right. Everything else is externally visible. So this is the only one. So that's you make a good question. Just practically, even if it is puzzle, how would you know? So maybe that, or maybe you could hear it. You shake it, you hear the liquid moving around. But again, that's a good reason to underscore the issue that's what's the kiddush about this, is that you're saying you wouldn't even know, and I'm saying, and why would it be a problem? It doesn't affect the aesthetics and so on. And that again sort of shows a desire just to draw from this world of treifot. But you're right. There's a practical question of how would you have access to that information? Okay, so now we move to the areas where more comfortable, are more external, and also doesn't require knowledge of treifot. So let's now take a look at the rest of the lists. So the Gemara says like this: Amar. So we said esrog kushi pasul. If it is black, but literally Ethiopian, it's invalid. Vatanya kushi kasher dome kushi pasul. 1 minute. We have a braita that says if it's actually from Ethiopia, then it is kasher. If it is similar to an Ethiopian, if it's black, it's pasul. So they're understanding kushi actually means that it grew in Ethiopia. Okay, so how do you deal with that? Then this seems to say that even if it's an Ethiopian esrog that itself makes it invalid. So Amar Baye kitnan nami masnisin dome kushi tnan. Yes, when our Mishnah or also the earlier Braita that said an esrog kushi is pasul, we mean black. We don't mean Ethiopian. Rava says lo kash. It's not difficult. Halan halahu. That's for them. This is for us. What does that mean? So take a look at Rashi. Rashi halan halahu. La'ola masnisin kushinami pasil. Even an Ethiopian esrog is invalid. The lokash masnisin bnei Eretz Yisrael sherechoki meretz kush. The Mishnah that says an Ethiopian esrog is invalid is in Israel, where they're distant from Ethiopia. The Einam regiling behem, and they're not used to seeing Ethiopian esrogim. So that's a problem. The Brisa that says an Ethiopian esrog is kasher, libnei Bavel, shekrovim lakush, they're close to Ethiopia, regiling behem, and they see esrogim from Ethiopia more regularly, and therefore it is not umikomakom begadol kan v'dom lakushi nidmehu pasul. If actually, but everybody would agree that if it grew here and is a black, that's a problem. The question is, if it's genuinely from Ethiopia, so is that a problem or not? Does it look too strange to not look like an esrog? And according to Rashi, so the question anyway is, I have to tell you, which I sort of have been trying to gloss over, but the Gemara is sort of assuming that Ethiopian esrogim grow black. The same way the people in Ethiopia are black. I didn't exactly say, look, the Gemara didn't say it explicitly. Just said Ethiopian esrogim are a problem. But I think what it's sort of suggesting, and Rashi says it explicitly, a previous Rashi, which I'm going to get back and read in a minute, is there seems to be an understanding that if the people in Ethiopia are black, the esrogim are black. So the problem is like this. If you have an esrog that grows here and it's supposed to grow yellow and it grows black, everybody agrees it's pasul. Because that's, not the normal color for these homegrown esrogim. But let's say you have an esrog that grew black and in its place that was natural. Does that make it invalid or not? Because it's not like it's something it shouldn't be in an objective sense. It's exactly natural for it. And there it goes by a more relative measure if we are used to it and we would see it as strange or we would not see it as strange. It goes into these interesting questions about the whole idea of the concept of normal. What's normal? You live in a metropolis, in a city where there's a much more wider range of people. Your tolerance, hopefully, grows because your understanding of what is normal or the natural diversity, is very different, and you don't see things as objectionable or strange, as opposed to if you have a much more limited type of an experience, things that are seen as problems and strange and not normal, etc. So that's quite fascinating. What's fascinating also from a halachic standpoint is that the definition of hadar can be subjective, right? As opposed to just, well, it's the rabbis had to determine. Fine, the rabbis had to determine because aesthetically nice can mean anything, but we figure once they determine, they're determining a universal standard. And here they're actually saying that an element of beauty, right, is something that feels like, doesn't feel, I mean, some people actually think if it's exotic, it's beautiful, but okay. But, some things that look strange are not beautiful, but that is relative to who you are and what your experience is and what you're used to. So that's quite fascinating that the same esrog, you bring it to Bavel, it's kosher. You transport it to Eretz Yisrael, it becomes puzzles. That's one thing. Now, why is the difference about why would everybody agree, even if a black esrog from Ethiopia is kosher in Bavel because we're used to it? Why is a normal esrog that grows here that turned black invalid? So look at the previous Rashi. Dome Lakushi, like the last narrow line, Gadal kan v'reyu shachur, it grew here and it became black. So in that case, everybody would agree it's pasul, or it's pasul even in Bavel, even where we're used to Ethiopian esrogim, pasul shenidmehu, because it is becoming like something else. Anybody can read that next word? Counterfeit. Belaz. Avakushi atzmo hainutam dekasher de urchehu. So as the fact that it's trying to pretend to be something it's not, that also, it's a home grade, it's a Babylonian esrog that's black. That's unusual. That's wrong. It's like there's a sense of wrongness to it. Whereas if that's the way it should be, okay, then it's just maybe a question of how exposed I am to it. Yes.
Rashi is very clear that Kushi means it's black esrog.
Yeah.
But the Gemara doesn't have to be read that way. It could be. It looks different somehow.
I know.
That actually makes more sense. Dono Kushi means it's black.
Right, as opposed to Kushi just means it's from Ethiopia, and those esrogim are different. That's why I said in the Gemara you could get away with saying that Kushi does not mean an assumption that Ethiopian esrogim are black. It just could be that Ethiopian esrogim are different in some way. Yes.
Unless either my geography or Rashi's geography is wrong. Yeah. Because Ethiopia is actually closer to Israel.
Oh, is it?
They comment on that here.
Yes. Yeah. I was trying to figure out, but it's true. Even the most.
Trading, trade routes.
Yeah. Does he say anything interesting there in the footnotes?
Yeah. The Rashash wonders about this explanation, pointing out that Ethiopia is closer to Israel than to Babylonia, which was in the area that is today southern Iraq. However, this is true only if one travels by land. If one leaves Ethiopia by sea and crosses the Bab al-Mandab, the 20-mile wide strait at the foot of the Red Sea to Arabia, the distance to Babylonia is shorter than the distance to Eretz Yisrael. Furthermore, the land route from Ethiopia to Eretz Yisrael crosses the Sahara Desert and thus exceedingly treacherous. Accordingly, Rashi would seem to imply that travel between Ethiopia and Babylonia is more common than travel between Ethiopia and Eretz Yisrael.
Interesting. Do they say anything about whether Kushi means that the assumption that Ethiopian esrogim are black, or they say it's black? Does Steinsaltz say anything there, Charlie, or
nothing?
Because it is possible to read the Gemara, like as Dov said, and as I indicated, that Ethiopia, it's just assuming Ethiopian esrogim are different, not necessarily black. But Rashi seems to indicate that the assumption that if it's from Ethiopia, it's black. Yes.
The other place that I know of where a culturally determined subjective criterion applies to halachic implications is SNU, certain issues in SNU.
It's interesting, Well, but another thing I would also say, which gets us closer to this world of mumim and korbanot, is the case by a Kohen who is who has certain issues in terms of dress and appearance and so on, should not be ola leduchan because he'll distract people. But it says v'imdash bi'iro, if he's if he's somebody that's like people are familiar with in that neighborhood, in that city, then he can go up to the duchan. So that's actually similar because it has to do with appearance and the appearance looking at strange and distracting and so on. So that's actually more of an analogy that I would make, and that also bases on like whether it's seen as familiar or not. Okay,
that's what I said about the distance, actually.
Yes.
I mean, maybe as a crow flies, but it's not so easy to get to like the Galil, let's say, because you can go up the Gulf of Eilat, but then what do? You have to go over land.
Right.
To go to Iraq, you can, I suppose, go up the Tigris or the Euphrates River through the Gulf of Persia.
All right, there you go. All right, Snan. We taught in the Mishnah. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Esrog haboser. A unripe esrog. Rabbi Akiva posel v'chachamim machshirim. So Rabbi Akiva invalidates, the Chachamim say it's valid. Now, we also have discussed before the size of an esrog, and maybe is that related or not. The Gemara, before you might remember, talks about boser being an issue about whether it's gemar peri, whether it's ripe or not, and it doesn't have can it be labeled a fruit. So let's take a look. Amar Rabba, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shimon, Amar Davar Echad. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shimon say the same thing, meaning they're following this. They have the same halachic position. Rabbi Akiva had the Amrin. Rabbi Akiva, what we said about invalidating an unripe estrog. Rabbi Shimon Mahi. What's Rabbi Shimon? Nah, we taught in the Mishnah Maisrot, having nothing to do with lulav. Rabbi Shimon poteres esrogim bikotnan. Rabbi Shimon says you don't have to take meiser from esrogim when they're still small. So presumably when they're small and unripe, they're not yet considered to be a fruit. So the same way Rabbi Akiva would say it's not a fruit for lulav, so Rabbi Shimon says it's not a fruit for the obligation of trumas and meisras. So Amalei Abaye, so Abaye responded, Diamalohi, maybe those are unrelated positions. Ad kan lo kama Rabbi Akiva hachar. Until this point, Rabbi Akiva only said his position by lulav and esrog. Diba'in hadar veleka. It's not an issue of defining it as a fruit. It's a question of what's considered beautiful. It's an aesthetic issue. Aval hasam balance really. Maybe they hold like the rabbis. It's chayiv and meiser, even though it's unripe. It's just a hadar issue. It's not an issue of defining it as a fruit. And it's chayiv and meiser. Inami. Or, so that's how Rabbi Akiva might actually be willing to call it a fruit, and it's just a technical problem by lulav. Or you could go the other way. Ad kan lo kama Rabbi Shimon hasam. Rabbi Shimon there, who says it's invalid, or not invalid, not obligated, is not because it's not defined as a fruit. Ela d'chsiv, because the verse says, Aser taser eit kol tvat zarecha, you shall take meiser of all of the tefuah of your seed. So what's the point of the word seed there? Kederach shebnei adam motzim lizriya. It has to be the fruit or the grain has to be at a stage of ripeness that you could actually use it to seed, to take the grain and plant for more for the seeds of the grain to plant for more grain, or take the seeds of the fruit and plant more fruit. So it's not enough that it be food; it has to be motzi lezera, able to be planted. So that's why, sure, an unripe esrog is defined as a fruit and it's aesthetic and you can use it for your esrog. The only thing is you're not chayv and meiser because it's not at the stage where you can plant it. Here's good old like the rabbis, and it's kosher for a lulav. So they're totally different concerns. V'tulo midi, and I don't want to hear any more discussion. That's like a nice way to that's where it says, I don't want to hypothetically it is the same. No, it very clearly are different concerns. Here an aesthetic concern, there a concern of motzi lazera. There's no need to say that they're somehow linked positions. Okay, now we move on to the next one. Gidlo b'defus, if you grew it in a mold, v'asa'okimin biryachares, to the point where it looks like a completely different creature, pasul, it's invalid. Amar Rava says, Rava lo shanu elakimin biryachares. That's only if you really made it looking like some different type of a thing. Aval kibiryaso, if it looks like a normal estrog would look, kasher, it's obvious. It says pshita, of course. Kimin biryachares, Tanya. That the Braita says when you make it looking like something different. No. Tzricha de avida dape. What you did is you made it sections, meaning the way Rashi says, it's like Rashi, it's like a water wheel, right? Imagine a water, right? It's got like little protrusions, like overlaying protrusions, like shutters, on top of one another. So that even that, the way Rashi reads it, even that is considered enough kibriyaso. So it's just wild. Rashi says, "Kimin krashim ken gagal shel rechaim shamayim v'ravash minin tuhunami briyaso." So basically, Rava's point is it has to really be significantly unusual. Even if you do something like this, make like little, like little shingles on it. Even that would be close. It would be natural enough to be kosher, which is quite surprising. Okay, that gets, as I said,
be pretty weird and still be kosher.
Exactly. Which I know that even. I know. Once it's that, it's already considered not briya. So it is interesting that Rashi reads it l'kula. Correct. Okay, Itmar. Now, this next discussion here is huge in terms of the question that I raised at the beginning of the Masechet, which is, do the invalidities of esrog apply, or lulav and esrog apply during Chol HaMoed after the first days? Major debate of Ashkenazim and Sfardim. So let's take a look. Itmar, it was taught. Esrog shenakvu ha'achparim, an esrog that the rats had made holes in it. Amar Rav said, they chewed a little bit at it. Ein zeh hadar, it's not hadar. Okay, so it's puzzle, clearly. Aini, is that really true? We know that Rabbi Chanina would dip his esrog into salt because they would dip their things into whatever vinegar, and he'd take a nice bite out of his esrog, and then he'd use it for the mitzvah. so first of all, there's a question about, isn't it hooked to the mitzvah? So you're not allowed to use mitzvah objects for other things, but we're going to ignore that problem for right now. So the Gemara, so how could Rav say it's a problem if it has bite marks in it? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Chanina kasha masnisen, but the Mishnah is a problem for Rabbi Chanina, because the Mishnah says that if it has a hole and is missing a little bit, it's pasul. So how could he take a bite out of it and eat it? So the Gemara says, no. We could reconcile our Mishnah with Rabbi Chanina. Kan b'yantav rishon, kan b'yantav sheni. That maybe the problem of hole in an esrog is only a yantav rishon problem, not a yantav sheni problem. Okay, so fine. He did it on yantav sheni. He did it on chol hamoed. Rav kasha, but according to Rav, it's difficult because Rav says ein zahadar. Now, why can't you say that Rav also his only problem is yantav rishon, not yantav sheni? Right? If we said that Rabbi Chanina did it because on the other days, and that's how he works with the Mishnah, when Rav says it is a problem, let Rav be talking about the first day. So the way Rashi reads this Gemara, and most Rishonim have this girsa, there's a question of a girsa, says no, because the word Rav uses hadar. And hadar, beautiful, is something that you need for all 7 days. That's not a first day invalidity. So if Rav said it's not hadar, that means all 7 days. So that doesn't fit with Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Chanina at least did it on Chol HaMoed. How do you reconcile Rav and Rabbi Chanina? Maybe they're arguing, but if we wanted to reconcile them, how would you reconcile them? So the says, Amal Rav, so Rav would say back to you, Shani Achbarim Demi'isi. No, rats is particularly disgusting. So yes, the other days you can have an estrog you took a bite out of, but you can't have an estrog that the rats took a bite out of. Now, read this way, right? Any problem that is a problem of hadar, because Rav said it's not aesthetic, is a 7-day problem. Rabbi Chanina, the bite out of the esrog, a hole, which is not a hadar problem, that's only a day 1 problem, not the other day. Not the other days. And that's why Rabbi Chanina did it the other days. So what's the problem? If it's not a hadar problem, why can't you take it on day 1? So Rashi makes up, because it's not in the Gemara, a new problem from ulkach tem. Remember we said l'kichat tama, which means you have to take all of them. So Rashi says that same word tama means that each object has to be whole. So if it has a hole in it, without the W, if it's missing, if it's chaser, but that's only a problem on day 1, like ulkach tem lachem bayom harishon. So Rashi creates a new problem called not whole, not complete, and it's a day 1 problem. But anything that's a hadar problem is a 7-day problem. So when you take a bite out of it, for some reason, it's still considered hadar. Don't ask me about that.
Right.
It's not complete. It's not whole. So that's a day 1 problem. That's the Mishnah. Rabbi Chanina did his thing on Chol HaMoed. When Rav says it's not hadar, that's a 7-day problem. That would only be with the rats. That's the way Rashi reads it, which leads to the conclusion that anything that's a hadar problem is puzzle all 7 days. Let's read the end, and then I'll tell you how the others, how the Chachmei Sfarad read this Gemara. Ikadami, some say Amar Rav Zeh hadar. Rav actually said even when the rats took a bite out of it, it still remains hadar. Rabbi Chanina matu beivin afikba. Rabbi Chanina, it's saying like Rabbi Chanina did. He was yotzei with the nesrog with a hole in it, with a bite mark. Rabbi Chanina kasha masin. Okay, but if they're both saying it's okay, what about the Mishnah that says the hole is no good? No, lo kasha, kan be yantav rishon, kan be yantav sheni. That's on yantav rishon, and that's, like I said, some new problem that it's not whole, but it still is hadar, and therefore you can use it at least on chol hamoed. So read this way, if it's a hadar problem, it's a problem even on chol hamoed. So the number of rishonim read this Gemara, and there actually was a different girsa in this Gemara, where the Gemara rejects Rav. Rav says ein ze hadar by the rats, and the Gemara says velohi. That's not true. It's not a problem because Rabbi Chanina was yotzei on Chol HaMoed. And the way a number of Rishonim read the Gemara is that the Gemara is actually saying, yes, it's true, it might not be Hadar, but it doesn't matter. You can still use it on Chol HaMoed. That actually read that the conclusion from Rabbi Chanina, who took a bite and ate it, was not the claim that it still is Hadar, and therefore he was able to use it on Chol HaMoed. The claim was it doesn't matter if it's Hadar or not Hadar. All of the psulim are Yontav Rishon psulim. And Rabbi Hanina used it on Chol HaMoed, even though it wasn't Hadar. And Rav, who wanted to create a problem and saying that Hadar had to be for all 7 days, it's not true. It was only a 1 day problem. It is not a 7 day problem. So a number of Chachmei Sfarad with a different gears in this Gemara come to the exact opposite conclusion. Not that if it's Hadar, it's 7 days, and therefore we have to distinguish rats isn't Hadar, human bites is Hadar, etc. But regardless of even if it's not Hadar, like you see from Rabbi Hanina, it's only a problem on the first day, not on Chol
Why do they
HaMoed.
need a different girsah to reach that conclusion?
Because the implication of our girsa, I don't want to, if you look at it, the implication of our girsa is, since Rav says it's not Hadar, that implies all 7 days, and therefore we have a problem, and the only way we reconcile it is not by rejecting Rav's principle, but by claiming that there's a difference between rats and human bites. But we still fundamentally, in our girsa, agree to the principle that if it's a Hadar issue, it will be a Chol HaMoed problem. Whereas according to some of the Chachmei Sfarad and the different girsa, they read no. The conclusion is we reject Rav, and even if it's a Hadar problem, it's only a day one problem. And this, as I said, is this big debate of whether the psulim apply on the other days of Yontav or not. It comes all the way down to the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. The Shulchan Aruch basically says that the psulei esrog pretty much are only on the first day, and the Ramah says they're on all. They apply on Chol HaMoed as well. Yes.
This terminology of Yom Tov Sheni, is this common?
Yeah, so I mentioned that at the beginning. Yom Tov Sheni is here by the Rishonim understood to mean Chol HaMoed, not Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golios. Why, and because there's a general assumption that Yom Tov Sheni Shel Golios is the exact same halach of Yom Tov Rishon, although there is some discussion about that. But yes, I don't know. I'd have to check to see if elsewhere the Gemara uses Yom Tov Sheni, like outside of this perek, to refer to Chol HaMoed. It is a good question. There are mishnayot that say like Yom Tov Harishon Shel Sukkot . There's actually a very strange mishnah that says Yom Tov Harishon Shel Rosh Hashanah, etc. Because there's no Chol HaMoed it's contrasting it to. Yom Tov Hashanah is just a Yom Tov, and it's not contrasting it to the second day Yom Tov either. So anyway, but yes, a common phrase in a mishnah is Yom Tov Harishon, which seems to be pointing out not because it's the Mishnah, it's not Babel, it's not Chutz La'aretz, seems to be using that phrase meaning Yom Tov, i.e. Yom Rishon, not the first Yom Tov. But yes, so there does seem to be that understanding that Yom Tov Sheni means the second day of the Chag, not the second day of Yom Tov. Yes.
You're telling me in the middle of Chol HaMoed, they just finished Hallel, he takes a bite out of it.
All right, yeah. Well, as long as it's still Hadar, he was hungry. I don't know what to say.
Unbelievable.
I don't know what to say. Moving on. Esro Katan, if it is a small etrog, going back to our Mishnah says, if it's small, is it the size of a nut or the size of an egg? What's the minimum size? So Abban Rafram Bar Papa Timachlokas Kan Kach Machlokas Ba'avanim Mikur Zalot. So the same debate here is the same of these stones that are used for wiping yourself. Okay, these toilet paper stones. What exactly the word Mikur Zalot means? Rashi says it means that they're somewhat pointed so that they can do the job. It says no, actually it's not what it means, and also who really wants pointed stones to wipe yourself? It says it means they're smooth stones. Okay, anyway, so using these stones that was used for wiping themselves after going to the bathroom. Tanya, b'Shabbat, on Shabbat, Gimel Avanim Ukorzalot Mutar Lachnis Lebeit HaKisei. So they allowed you, this is one of the classic applications about Kavod HaBriot, that they waived rabbinic restrictions. They allowed you to carry stones which are muktzah on Shabbat in order to take them into the bathroom. They had bathrooms out in the field, like outhouses, to wipe yourself. And how much did they allow you? 3 stones. The Kamashuran, how big were they? Rabbi Meir Omer Egoz, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Kibetza. So it's the same debate of an Egoz and a Beitza. So again, here the point is, as opposed to our Mishnah where it was a minimum size, here it's like a maximum size. Bigger than that is not useful for bathroom purposes. So it's not exactly the same debate, and the Gemara isn't claiming there's any logical link to the debate, but it is interesting that the same Rebbe Meir that says an egos is the minimum size of an esrog says it's the maximum size of this wiping stone, and Rebbe Yehuda that says it's the minimum, Beit says the minimum size of an esrog says that's the maximum size of this wiping stone. So it's an interesting parallel, but nobody is suggesting any logical link, and again, it's a difference between a minimum and a maximum. You thought once we left brachos we were out of bathroom and wiping and so on. Now, by the way, Tosfos makes an interesting point because Rashi says l'chiddush is you're allowed to move muktzah. Tosfos says, but Rashi says you're only moving it in a karmelis. That actually you're not moving it from a karmelis to rishus hayachid. So it says, what do you mean? First of all, the word beit hakisei sounds like it's surrounded by walls, and you're moving it into it, meaning from the yard. So you're moving it from a karmelis into a rishus hayachid, and the phrase of lahachnis sounds that way. So Tosfos says they not only allowed muktzah, they even allowed you, again, rabbinically, it's a rabbinic problem, to move it from a karmelis to a rishut hayachid. Okay, they even allowed you to do that, and Tosfos even says that might even be easier to allow than muktzah. Muktzah is very chamur. Now, what about, Tosfos then gets to the point, what about nowadays? Can we apply the same principle nowadays? Can we put stones, move stones into our outhouses nowadays? So Tosfos says, well, no, because there they had like temporary outhouses out in the field, where now, we have very we have bathrooms we know we're going to use, we know where they are, they're the ones we use regularly, so we should prepare the toilet paper or the stones or whatever before Shabbos. So if you forgot to prepare, that was sort of your fault, we won't be lenient. But then he's not so sure. And if you look at the end of Tosfos B'Shabbat, Tosfos says like this. He says like this. He says, three lines above the word desiv, the next Tosfos, he says like this. Hasam b'sadot Iri, the makam rachoku, v'torach lahazmi mer Shabbat. There it was out in the fields, it was far away from the house, so we don't say you have to go Erev Shabbos and put stones in the outhouse. Toilet paper in the outhouse. For us, we have actually a bathroom in the house. Usher, Elim Kane, he's mean. It's easy. Prepare the stuff from before Shabbat. And if you forgot to, then you can't. We're not going to allow it. It's your own responsibility. It's so easy to do. The Shema, but maybe you could say, even the Nefishi, B'nei Abayis, since you got a lot of people in the house, so they'll use up the toilet paper that you cut before Shabbos. So lo afshar v'shari, maybe we can even do it even as necessary. And this actually becomes questions. People get stuck in a bathroom that then they realize nobody has tissues or pre-cut toilet paper. What do you do? So I'm not going to get into a whole discussion, but let's assume that for most part, whatever problem there is with cutting toilet paper, it's probably only d'Rabbanan because it's not a real kli. It's made for disposable and so on. So the Kavod HaBrios issue certainly takes over. I try to be a little bit frum, so what I do is I like tear it with a shinoi. Sometimes I hold on with my teeth, I go like that, to tear it. But we do have allowances for Kavod HaBrios, particularly in bathroom contexts. And Tosfos has an interesting question. It translates to nowadays, but you could have prepared it before Shabbos. Okay, but sometimes you're stuck, and there's still a Kavod HaBrios reality. I remember somebody told me that he was once stuck he was on a boat, and he went into the bathroom in the boat, and as he closed the door, the light went on. Right? So he says, what do I do now? They spend the whole Shabbos in the bathroom? Because as soon as I open the door, the light's going to go out. So you could open it with a shino or whatever. He said, you had to be on the boat to figure out the answer. He said, because you're there with the rocking of the boat. He says, I just unlatched it and I let it open by itself. So it's a good start. Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Tosfos' dodge is pretty weak, right? Because you have a lot of people say, I don't want stones.
Yeah, but I understand.
Does anybody know, what?
Okay.
What was the actual design of the bathroom in the Middle Ages?
I don't know. I'm sure we can find out. Ask Chaim Soloveitchik. I don't know. But Godel Kadei, he just came out with his new collected essays. Maybe he has one essay on that. Okay. Godel Kadei Yochaz. So a big one. You have to be able to hold two in one hand. Or the next position is even Rabbi Akiva says even one in. Was it Rabbi Akiva? Who was it? It was Rabbi Yossi says even if it's so big that you need two hands to hold one, as opposed to the first position, which was two esrogim in one hand. Tanya, I'm Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yossi, to prove his idea that it could be a huge esrog, said, Ma'aseh Rabbi Akiva. There was a story with Rabbi Akiva, Shabbat Beis HaKnesset, the esrogo aktefo. He came to the shul, he had such a huge esrog, he was carrying it on his shoulder. So Amalo Rabbi Yehuda, so Rabbi Yehuda says it has to be smaller. Said to him, Sham Raya, you want to bring a proof from there? They said to him, hey buddy, bigger isn't always better. That's not beautiful, okay? So therefore, so you see, it's not good. Now, Rashi points out that it sounds like the issue is Hadar. The Gemara before said the issue was that you have to be small enough so that if you're holding the lulav and esrog in one hand, it won't fall out. So Rashi claims that we're not backing down from that. Rabbi Yehuda's concern is a practical one, that it'll fall out. But he'll say, even if that's not your concern, you should at least concede to me that beyond a certain size, it's not going to be Hadar. Okay, now let's look at the next Mishnah. Ein ogdim es alulav ela b'mino. you can only bind the lulav with the something from the arba minim. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says. You can't do something else. Use like a string or a chain or whatever. Rabbi Meir Omer af b'chut b'mishicha. Even with like a string or with a band. Amar Rabbi Meir, said Rabbi Meir, there's a story with the people of Yerushalayim that they would bind their lulav with like golden chains. So you see, you don't need to use one of the arba minim. So Amrulo, they said back, which is interesting, they, because until now it's only been Rabbi Yehuda saying it. No, at the bottom it was bound together with some, let's say, part like a lulav leaf. And the chain was something nice they added, but the basic eged was with a lulav leaf. So Amar Rava, let's see the Gemara. Rava says, "Afilu b'siva, afilu b'ikra dedikla." When you use one of the arba minim for Rabbi Yehuda, it doesn't have to be beautiful. Even if you use some type of a vine, not exactly vine, whatever, some type of a strip of leaf that grows around a palm tree, or even the trunk, you make a strip from the trunk that you're able to use as a string. It doesn't have to be beautiful because it's not about beauty. Rava, my time with Rabbi Yehuda. Why does Rabbi Yehuda demand that you use one of the arba minim? It's not about hadar. Kasavar, no, it's a technical point. Lulav tzarech eged. Lulav needs to be bound. We had that discussion before. If you don't bind it, you're not yotzei according to Rabbi Yehuda. And therefore, if you bring something that's not from the arba minim, or the three minim, I should say, something that's not from those things that make up the lulav, havi chamisha minim, it would bring an external thing into the very mitzvah object. For Rabbi Yehuda, since it needs to be bound, anything that is part of the binding within the sort of strap, and the strap itself, that makes up the mitzvah object. So you would be making the mitzvah object with something external to the mitzvah. It's interesting. So even if it's not a halachic lulav or halachic hadas, but it's from the right tree, that's not considered to be something external. But if it was something external, that would invalidate it. The Amar Rava, and Rava says, Mina la. Where do I know this from? Deceive ikra dedikla mina duluvahu, meaning not the reason of Rabbi Yehuda. That is just misvara, that it's connected to his position that lulav needs an eged. But how do I know that these things are considered to be part of the lulav tree itself? The Tanya, we turn in Brisa. Basukos teishvu. You should dwell in Sukkot. Sukkah shall call davar. Rabbi Meir says you could make your sukkah out of everything, anything. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, ain't sukkah no hegas ela ba'arba minim shebululav. That's fascinating, right? We learned all of the Masechet. We don't remember exactly hearing that. He says you can only make the schach, presumably not the walls. We'll see tomorrow, not the walls, but you can only make the schach out of the arba minim. Havadin notain, and that's logical. Here's the Kavachomer. Lulav she'ein noheg b'laylos could be yomim, ein noheg arba minim. Lulav, which is only a day mitzvah, has to be done with the arba minim. Sukkah she'nohegas b'laylos could be yomim. Sukkah, which is a day and a night mitzvah, ein no din shalotei el arba minim. Obviously, would have to be with the arba minim, which is what a wild Kavachomer. Why don't we say shofar is only a day mitzvah? You have to use a shofar, so therefore, sukkah, which is a night and a day mitzvah, you have to use a shofar. Anyway, Amrulo, let's see what they said back to. Kol din shatadan tchilasu lahachmir v'sofu lahakel eino din. Any kavachomer you make that's not really saying, it has to be more strict and demand the arba minim. If it's going to turn into a leniency, it's not a kavachomer. What's the leniency? Lo matzah arba minim yoshevu batel. According to you, if you can't find arba minim to make your sukkah, he will say, I'm not going to sit in a sukkah. So by creating extra demands, you think you're being machmir, you're actually being mekel, because you're basically making it impossible for some people to do the mitzvah. Now that's a really important principle, right? And it says, let's be machmir, make more demands. How many people are you excluding by your chumras? How much more difficult are you making it for people to be mekayim? That's not always a chumrah. That could be defined as a kula. So you can't make a kavachom. I know. It's true. But here, So anyway, Vator Amru, Basukos Teishvu, Shivas Yamim, Sukkah Shokol Dover. The Torah wants you to dwell in Sukkah. So we'll pick up with this tomorrow, but we're going to see how this fascinating discussion about Sukkah, which we went through the whole first two prakim without talking about, is going to lead to a discussion about what constitutes the arba minim that you can use for making your knot in your lulav, according to Rabbi Yehuda. He demands arba minim, but according to Rava, not according to the Mishnah, he demands arba minim, but according to Rava, it's a broad definition of arba minim, and we'll see more about that tomorrow. Okay.
So, in the Middle Ages, chamber pots